we cannot solve this company by company. We can only solve this by having government work directly with big companies and together go community by community, figuring out what is the unlock for those communities. It's the only way that I feel we can have a long-term sustainable solution to this, because I can tell you right now, for example, in Miami, very soon, most likely, we won't be able to go to the supermarket anymore, right? So what are we going to do with those houses that are running out of food? How do you support them, right? So those are the kinds of things that I think we need to be thinking about.
Welcome to Coffee with Mr. IoT, a weekly chat with Robert Schmidt, Deloitte's chief futurist, and the builders, dreamers, founders, and wild children of the IoT universe. This podcast can also be viewed on the Coffee with Mr. IoT YouTube channel.
Hello and welcome to another Coffee with Mr. IoT. My name is Robert Schmidt. I'm Deloitte's chief futurist, also known as Mr. IoT. And today, as my guest, we have Rafa with me. Rafa, welcome to the show. Tell us, you and I work together all the time. We see each other at meetings, or we have seen each other at meetings. Now we're meeting this way. Give us a little intro of what you do, and tell us also where you're at actually right now in times like this.
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, thank you, Robert. Appreciate the opportunity to be in the show. My name is Rafa Calderon. I'm a partner with Deloitte, been in consulting for about almost 20 years, between consulting and industry, mostly in supply chain. I practice supply chain strategy, planning and transformation, and mostly focus on consumer packaged goods as well as retail. The times we're living is unprecedented, but also if you could actually try to find a silver lining in these kinds of situations, I think there's a lot of opportunity to innovate and to reinvent. Absolutely, we are all praying for all the people that are suffering in terms of the situation, and we hope to get out of it as quickly as we can. But at the same time, we also have to try to use this as an opportunity to rethink the way we do things, how we think about business, how we think about supply chain. So in times like this, I'm at home, taking care of my 5 kids, my wife.
How are you doing? How are you and your kids doing?
They're doing good. We're all adjusting, right, to this new mode. They're not so used to see daddy so much here. So sometimes it's hard because they see you through the window and they want to play, and they don't understand why you don't want to play. It's not like you don't want to play, but you have to keep working. So it's a struggle, right? And I know every working parent right now is going through that. So very, very aware of all the circumstances and complications, but at the same time, we always have to find opportunity. We always have to find the silver lining, like I said, and everything that goes on. So it's an unprecedented time, but at the same time, it's also something where I think we have an opportunity to make our mark and potentially change this world for the better.
What's going on for you with your connection to Europe today? How is that going?
Yeah, so it's difficult, right? Because life in Europe is very disrupted at the moment, right? Life in Europe, everybody's so used to living in close quarters. There's so much cross-pollination of cultures and exchange. It's difficult, right? If I think about, for example, my wife is from Italian descent. She was explaining to me, some of the things that some of her friends are going through, in some of these small towns where, there's a supermarket that potentially has food for a day in the village, right? And this village is remote, and they've been completely disrupted. Their food supply is disrupted. People can't get food. Hospitals are overwhelmed. It's a very traumatic experience, and I think that it's a difficult thing for us because there's only so much we can do to help. When I think about the opportunities we have and the resources we have in the United States, it's you always feel for the Europeans right now in terms of what they can do. At the same time, if we think about the business world, a lot of my colleagues in Europe, it's hard for them, right? I have a house here in Miami where I have the opportunity to maybe find a corner in the house where I can work from, potentially have an office. But some of our colleagues, don't have that luxury, right? The spaces are more concentrated, they're smaller. So how do you make it work, with your family and trying to continue to be productive at work, but at the same time be an effective parent at home? Right now, for example, we have friends in Europe that are been in their apartment for weeks, right? And it's they come out of the balcony, they sing songs to each other. We saw that in Italy, we saw that in Spain, where people are trying to find ways to lift each other. And in all this chaos and in all these complications, I think people are finding also rediscovering aspects of their life that maybe they've forgotten, right? We all get into this rat race and we're all doing a lot of things, and we think that life is all about everything that we're doing and the places we're going, the trips that we're taking and the work that we're doing. And we forget that maybe life is a little simpler. It's being at home, being with your kids, being on the floor, playing with them. For me personally, I've realized, that there's a lot of things that, I'm not necessarily doing as much as I should have. And these times at home have definitely made us all rediscover that side of our lives, right? So that at least is good. But yeah, I think we all feel for Europe right now. I think it's important that the governments take very strong measures to quarantine. I mean, we've all talking about flattening the curve. It is absolutely essential for us to take that very seriously, stay home and flatten that curve so we can try to contain this to a point where the healthcare system can actually cope. I think COVID is going to be here for a while. If I think about the way we're thinking about business, we're working with our clients to prepare them for an elongated COVID scenario. I think that a lot of people are hoping we're going to get out of this pretty quickly and life is going to continue the way it was. I don't think that's the case. I think that work is going to change. I think that remote work is going to be here to stay. I think that the way we think about inventory buffers and the way we think about supply chains is going to dramatically change, because we are one step away from another COVID variant or another disease, right? So we need to start to maybe rethink the model of supply chain that we have today, where today was, in the past, if I think about supply chain, especially grocery and supermarkets, it was all about leaning the supply chain, have the minimum amount of stock that I need to have in the supermarket, and I'm just going to get deliveries multiple times a day. Well, that, we spend years trimming supply chains and trimming inventory buffers, and now we find ourselves without the inventory policy to be able to support all this, right? So I think we have to take a hard look at that, and especially with the food supply, and understand that maybe we need to restructure ourselves for a world that's a lot more unstable and a lot more, difficult to plan than perhaps we had in the past.
It's super interesting here you talk about Europe, right? We sometimes forget how lucky, well, I know I am. I can just walk outside and be in my yard with smaller space. But, I managed to actually be on the video with my brother in Vienna, my mom outside Vienna, my two kids who were both at different places. And we were all in one video call, and it was actually quite touching to do that. And then that same day, we played an online game. So I don't know, for me, this social distancing, it was actually much more social than I thought. It actually made me reach out. And in a way, I reached out to you because of that. And so let's just dive into one of you wrote an interesting paper together with a few other Deloitte folks. It's called The Black Swan of 2020, or at least that's one of them. Just tell us a little bit about it. What was the thought behind it? Also, it's actually a couple weeks old and things have really changed the last week so quickly. So tell us about it, and just love to hear a little bit about it and ask you questions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So when everything started to happen, I actually had a call from one of my clients. He's the chief supply chain officer for one of the largest food companies in the world, and he called me and said, "Look, I just got off the phone with corporate. The corporate centers in Europe, and they said, we're gonna basically raise our inventory levels 15-20% across the board to start to deal with this situation." And he said, "What do you think about that?" So that was on a Friday at 7 p.m. So I immediately, when I got that email, I immediately showed him back a note. I said, "Let me think through this and get something to you over the weekend." Immediately shot an email to some members of my team and said, "Team, this is, hate to bother you over the weekend. This is a moment that matters. This is a true important moment for us to come together, put our best thinking forward, and try to help our client think through this very difficult problem." The implications of him, raising inventory policy 15-20% are gigantic. I mean, this is a multi-billion-dollar company, one of the largest in the country, in the United States and across the world. And if you just basically start to raise inventories without really thinking about that strategically, you can end up wasting a lot of food and throwing away a lot of food. As you know, food expires, right? So you have to be very careful in terms of how do you manage that chain and that throughput of stuff. So we spent the weekend kind of working through some ideas in terms of how to use inventory buffers and how to think about demand and what actually is the real pattern of demand that we expect to see, so that we could be a lot more surgical in terms of where to actually apply changes in inventory policy or where it actually made sense to do some other things. We put those thoughts together over the weekend, sent it to him by Sunday night. He called me up the day after. He said, the material you guys put together, he said, I actually asked 3 consulting firms the same question on Friday. 3 of the partners who work with me. Your stuff is by far the best that we received. We've actually sent it to all the zones and to the head of global supply chain, and it was used as an example of what best-in-class thinking is, and the zones should start to apply in the COVID crisis. So at that same time, Jim Kilpatrick, who's our global head of supply chain for Deloitte, was writing a piece on COVID, and he reached out and said, "Hey, do you have some thoughts on this?" And so I shared with him what we had done, and then we immediately collaborated on this piece that he was authoring. So I had the opportunity to work with him on that. So it was very fast. We try to move to market quickly because we felt it was important for us to have a point of view to help our clients think through that. In 2 weeks, it's changed a lot. I think some of the fundamentals, when I think about the structure that we thought about, are the same, right? I mean, ultimately, I think the ultimate thinking here is.
So Rafa, give us some ideas. What were some of the points that you brought out that people could use today?
Yeah, so I think the first and underlying thought here is we have to try to anticipate where the demand is going, right? So I think we have to get very granular. If you have a data lake or you have some type of ability to mine your point of consumption data, try to understand exactly what is the magnitude and what are the changes in demand that you're seeing across SKUs in geographies and specific markets. And I think we want to try to take those behaviors and we try to converge those behaviors with what we're seeing in terms of local policy around COVID. So for example, we might have Seattle's been in lockdown for 4 weeks. So we know what Seattle has gone through in the last 4 weeks, and we can understand what people have done in those 4 weeks. So cities like Miami, are lagging Seattle, for example, and we can start to almost use this construct that we use for new products, where we take a similar product and we try to simulate that demand pattern for the next product. So what we're trying to do now is to try to take cities that are a little ahead, or cities like in Europe that are ahead of cities in the US, and try to understand, what does that demand behavior look like and how does that apply to the next city? That's the first thing, because supply chains are very zone oriented, right? Supply chains are structured, especially in food, they're structured around regions. And these are usually within kind of 400 miles of delivery for all these cities or in the city. So trying to get ahead of that and try to understand what that looks like is absolutely essential before we know how do we best redeploy the inventory in the network that we have, or better, how do we actually alter what we're producing? An example would be, if I have a simple pizza that I make, a frozen pizza, versus a pizza that has all kinds of ingredients, maybe I just make the simple pizza. And if I make the simple pizza, I can produce more food. If I can produce more food, I can push more food to the system, because right now my worry is not so much as a food company, how do I sell more, is how do I feed people? So I think that there's a fundamental first step, which is understanding that demand curve and understanding and predicting what that was going to look like. And then from there, then analyze the different kinds of options that exist, whether it's redeploying inventory from other parts of the network. You might, in the United States, you might be 1 to 3 days out to any particular location. Do I alter my production schedule, try to find maximum efficiencies by reducing the changeovers? Do I try to secure different alternate sources of supply, where perhaps I can increase my production capacity by immediately working with some of my co-manufacturers that have the ability to produce my goods? Do I try to secure extra distribution capacity so I can move more inventory around the network? So you basically go in that step, step by step, looking at the different tiers of the supply chain, understanding what supply chain segments you need to protect to be able to support those demand streams that you're anticipating based on those patterns that we just talked about, comparing cities to cities. That's the fundamental premise of the construct.
So basically, take the data we have and really use it.
Yes.
Everything is more dynamic now, so you're probably going to have to look at your data more often than you would typically do, right? Because it changes so much more now. Model that data for cities that are actually lagging in terms of the patterns that you see at other places. And then I heard an interesting comment, which was sort of like, maybe rethink your product somewhat. Is there a simpler product you can make more of and
Right.
therefore increase your output? Is that sort of like a good summary?
That's a great summary. That's exactly right. And that's the thought process that you need to take, right? So from a flow, right? If we think in supply chain, we think about flow and how do you keep the flow. So there's a, the way we're recommending to think about this, you need a command center, right? So you need a command center that's meeting daily. And that works as a control tower. You need to light up the whole supply chain, understand all of the capacity that you have, all of the factories, all your assets, where are they? How do you best use this puzzle? And then you need to make sure that you're monitoring conditions as they're changing, and then you're taking actions on a daily basis. So there's a very tactical aspect to this around lighting up and managing the flow, and then using whatever data you have. Data analytics here is going to be extremely useful in terms of being very surgical in terms of the actions that you take. So that's absolutely, to your point, the way you want to go about this. You don't want a peanut butter spread. You don't want to take generic actions across the supply chain, because you might have very different strategies that are needed depending on the geography or depending on the particular product that you're talking about. So you need to understand those relationships between SKUs, regions, segments of the supply chain, and then treat them as independent units that have different remedies for the particular changing conditions that are happening through this command center.
So I have a question for you, and it's a little outside supply chain, but it surprises me. I just thought of this when you talked about this. I think we talk a lot here right now about how we don't have enough testing data. We don't know how many people are really sick and in what areas, okay? But, and here comes the interesting one, you talk about all of your retailers, all of the people that have a big supply chain, they actually have data, they have consumption data. Mm-hmm. That doesn't directly relate. You cannot discuss correlation and get into some philosophical conversation about this, but at least it actually shows patterns of areas, what happens. Is that actually, what do you think about this? Is this actually a good way to kind of get around the problem of maybe not having all the data you want, use the data you do have, and actually create patterns out of that?
You absolutely can, and absolutely you should. I mean, time is of the essence here, right? So your ability to construct a data lake that you don't necessarily have, or the ability to get complete data is really not the objective. I think the objective is to use the data you have, absolutely, perhaps complete some data sets. Because here's what's happening, right? If I take a year's worth of history, right, it doesn't really help me. Statistics here don't really help you.
No kidding.
The last week in Seattle and how your product behaved there must be the best predictor of the next 2 weeks in Miami. So understanding those relationships of where the cities are in terms of their lockdowns and in terms of their state COVID policy, I think is truly essential. The other part that's really important here is to understand that if I can just look at this last week, last 2 weeks, last 3 weeks, and start to understand, when was the city put on lockdown? When did the mayor of the city announce that there was a change of conditions in the city? At that point, then something happened to the consumption. If I can marry the two pieces of data and be able to understand how the data that I'm seeing from a patterns of demand to the announcements that were made, I can start to understand the lag in terms of how people react to when things get announced. So there's ways for us to create some type of a model that we can then use to start to understand and predict what could happen. Now, the other factor here that's important, and we talk about, is there's only so much capacity in the supply chain, right? So if we're talking about food, for example, you only have so much refrigeration and frozen space in your house. So people have rushed to fill up their supplies, and they might have a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks of inventory. There's only so much capacity they have in their houses. So we need to understand that, and we can actually calculate kind of what that potential capacity of the market is, because if you look at when all the supermarkets stock out in a particular period of time, you can kind of estimate how much capacity exists in that city. And then at that point, you can start to understand, okay, what is that pattern of consumption that we're going to expect to see, and what are we seeing in terms of people restocking? And I think that there's opportunity there to then figure out, do you have an opportunity to go direct to houses? Do you have an opportunity to continue to go to the supermarket, so you do both? Is there an opportunity to partner with other companies and maybe local government, set up big depots? of food where we can actually set up kind of pantries and be able to then use this construct to feed people directly in their homes if, for example, we go on quarantine and nobody can get out of their houses. And I use the food supply as an example because it's the one that I'm closest to. But this is a fundamental construct that I think we all need to understand. We cannot solve this company by company. We can only solve this by having government work directly with big companies and together go community by community, figuring out what is the unlock for those communities. It's the only way that I feel we can have a long-term sustainable solution to this. Because I can tell you right now, for example, in Miami, very soon, most likely, we won't be able to go to the supermarket anymore, right? So what are we going to do with those houses that are running out of food? You know, how do you support them, right? So those are the kinds of things that I think we need to be thinking about.
So Rafa, I've heard a lot. So two things. One, I've heard a lot of people say companies that have already set up a digital supply network, people who have really gone down the digital development are at an advantage right now, right? Because they're more connected and so forth. But that's sort of like looking back, it's sort of like, okay, great, good job. I'm kind of curious, two things. One, Deloitte, we've done a really, I think, an awesome job in sort of saying to our clients, look, if you have something you think that you can do now that's going to generate value in 8 weeks, 12 weeks, don't wait. We help you around financing this. We help you with fees and so forth. I thought that was an immensely great move on our part in terms of really wanting to make an impact now. My question to you is, what are the things people should look at now that they can do for helping immediately, helping in a week, helping in a month, and not wait until the whole thing is over? What are one or two things? And I always like the idea of what technology is really missing in some places. What can we do today?
Yeah, well, so I think fundamentally the most important thing is you have to protect your people, right? So I think thinking about how to keep your people safe is absolutely essential. For the white collar worker, I think is immediately drafting out a policy and best practice around how to work from home. Understanding that the work schedule is going to change and we cannot solve it on a project by project. You have to issue some type of policy that helps people understand how we're going to work, what are the ways of working people from home. So I think you have to address that stakeholder group in terms of the administrative and be able to make sure that you have clear policy. In some cases, you might think about tools that you need to send out, or if you need to equip everybody with headsets or laptops or whatever the case might be to be able to effectively run the company from home using tools like Zoom. For example, Zoom is extremely useful. You can get up as to 500 people together on the camera at the same time. We can record sessions so that others can see it. We can participate on whiteboards and things like that. So certainly, technology is going to be very important. Now, that's one sector. When we have companies that have supply chains and have manufacturing plants, what are we doing to protect those workers? Make sure that we get perhaps a special suits so they can go and work in the factory and not contaminate other people, or masks or whatever the case might be. How do we protect our employees? I think is number one. I think number two is how do you make sure that you make information available to people so they can make better decisions? So having a central command center that is enabling the different functions of the company, trying to accelerate, trying to centralize, what are the big problems we're trying to solve, and trying to enable the different pods of the company, not create a central structure that tries to solve, but a central structure that tries to enable and facilitate information. Sometimes, especially with big companies, multi-matrix organizations, it's difficult to find that collaboration. So how do we unlock some of that by enabling that through a central command center? I think number three is we have to understand the DSN. So the digital supply network calls for us understanding the multiple paths that we can take. What are the ecosystem players that we can reach out to help with the equation? And, you might need a little more data. You might call, IRI and say, hey, I need some data on my consumption. Can you facilitate? A lot of companies are willing right now to help each other. It's not about making money right now. It's about survival and helping each other go through this crisis and weather the storm together. So I think the ecosystem partners here, whether it's software providers, system integrators, suppliers, can be truly helpful in helping you unlock problems so you don't have to solve everything by yourself. And then also sharing between either companies in the same industry or non-competitive sets, using your consultants to connect you to other companies and understand what are some of those best practices, things that are doing. I think sharing of ideas and using consulting companies to help aggregate knowledge, I think can also be very effective.
Rafa, I love this sharing of data between each other, particularly for people that aren't as global or as national as they could be, learning from other places. Just so you know, if there's any ideas you have that I can help you with, please reach out to me too.
Yes, sir.
I want to close by asking you, what did I not ask you that you want to talk about today in this situation?
What did you not ask me? You didn't ask me, when is when is the next time that I wanna sit down and play with my kids, and that can be soon. I'm trying to find ways to create some downtime for myself so I can take advantage of this precious time that I have being at home so much.
I gotta tell you, last Friday, I was home all week long, and I was so tired on Friday. I was like, wow, I didn't travel. How can I still be so tired? And I really enjoyed the weekend, just relaxing a bit. But Rafa, thank you. I appreciate the conversation. I hope you guys are safe and healthy with your kids and your wife. All the best. And with that, another Coffee with Mr. IT has come to an end. Thank you for watching.
Thanks for listening to Coffee with Mr. IoT. To subscribe or to listen to more episodes, search for Coffee with Mr. IoT in your favorite podcatcher, or find us online at deloitte.com/us/coffee with Mr. IoT. To watch the video version of our show, go to YouTube and search Coffee with Mr. IoT.